The time is 9:15, and we're going to be turning our attention to the biggest story right now globally, one that I think everyone is keeping a keen eye on, and we'll definitely be unpacking it and trying to analyze what happened in the last 24 hours. It's been called the 12-day war, a brutal high stakes conflict between Iran and Israel that has rocked the Middle East and sent tremors across global diplomacy. Overnight, US President Donald Trump announced a so called total ceasefire between the two bitter enemies, dramatically posting, "Please do not violate it," on his Truth social media account. But one thing that's interesting is this is no ordinary ceasefire. In the final hours before the guns went quiet, missiles rained down, killing civilians in Iran and Israel. A nuclear scientist reportedly assassinated, entire apartment blocks flattened, and deep unanswered questions remain. Is this truly the end of hostilities or just the eye of a coming storm? And what does this sudden truce mean for the region, for global powers, and for countries like South Africa that claim a principled foreign policy? Joining us now is someone who's been watching this unfolding crisis quite closely. I'll be speaking to Bilal, Bassiouni, CEO and founder of the Center for Africa and Near East Studies. We get into the ceasefire, the real power plays behind it, and what comes next for the Middle East and the world in a war that could ultimately consume all of us. Bilal, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Salam Media. Really appreciate you giving us your time this morning.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let's get into it. What was your initial immediate reaction when US President Donald Trump announced that the ceasefire was now in effect? Do you believe it's real? And the most important question, can it hold?
Yeah, very important questions. But anyone following the Trump presidency from its first term will know that you do not fall into the mistake twice of not understanding the volatility and the unpredictability that comes with a Donald Trump presidency. And we could see how quickly things can pivot and how quickly things can change from 48 hours of maximalist Iranian policy, including the threatening of killing the supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei, to God bless Iran within the space of a very short time, really indicates how volatile this conflict was, but also how quickly things can change on the ground. And from our last discussion that we had, Selelo, I emphasized a lot of these points, that the thresholds that could invite strong responses and retaliation could really push the conflict into either directions, but also signal the strength of back channel diplomacy, particularly the one that Qatar played in this conflict.
Mm, mm, mm. I want us now to, focus on Iran itself. Usually, there won't be any kind of negotiations where the USA and Israel is concerned. Let's talk about their show of strength in the last few weeks. Did it send a strong message, a strong signal to Israel, to the United States of America, that this is not a war that you want to get into? It has the possibility to engulf the whole of the Middle East and ultimately the whole world.
I think that would have been the intention, most definitely. But at the same time, it has shown a lot of cracks with inside Iran's security establishment. Of course, there was severe security breaches and infiltration, particularly from Mossad agents that have identified senior Iranian leadership, and also managed to kill a lot of that leadership, including nuclear scientists. Now, this is unprecedented in modern warfare, where so many senior leadership are taken out in such a short space of time, and also Iran's air defense systems really took a hard battering over the initial days from the preemptive strikes. Now, these, of course, will be lessons that Iran will need to learn and will need to correct for its future engagements if there will be such episodes. But at the same time, Iran did demonstrate its willingness and its capacity to fire back and test strongly test Israel's Iron Dome, and including making direct and high impact attacks on several locations within Israel. Of course, this is also unprecedented, and this would have been one of the catalysts why Israel would have wanted to recalibrate and return to the ceasefire, return to a posture of neutrality and ceasefire. So Iran's deterrence capability was somewhat restored over the last few days, and we saw a glimpse of what it would mean if for a regional conflagration, where we all saw last night those ballistic missiles flying over high skyrise buildings in Qatar's capital Doha, and the implications that would have, just for instance, on flights where at least three countries, Gulf countries, closed off their airspace in a very short period of time. Now, all of this are was a short stint, but it's still a strong indicator of the possibility of a regional conflagration and what this could mean for the region.
No, definitely. I was just looking at Trump, speak and going through his social medias, and one thing that really came out interesting for me is his claim that Israel has achieved its goal of neutralizing Iran's nuclear capabilities. Has that really happened, or is it again Trump's political theater at play?
Yeah, it's difficult to really see what Israel or the US really achieved from this conflict, but there is two at least operational outcomes that they have managed to gain from this confrontation. First, Israel succeeded in drawing the United States into direct military action, which was always its aim from the beginning, particularly involving it into Iran's nuclear infrastructure and nuclear program, something Israeli defense planners and strategists, which have long wanted, but also the US have long resisted, and including President Donald Trump, there was always a preference for negotiations around this issue. Now, joining it into a direct military confrontation creates the precedent for the possibility of returning into such an episode one more time. And the joint execution of strikes under combined operations have, in fact, degraded some of the facilities in Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. We still have to wait on the damage reports and to see the extent of the damages. But of course, this would have at least hindered Iran's enrichment timeline, but also demonstrated a strong capability to penetrate hardened targets. Now, this, of course, creates military and tactical knowledge around doing such exercises. The second, also, the strikes reinforced Israel's deterrence posture by showcasing its capacity to prompt quick US engagement, but also its own readiness to act against perceived existential threats. But the important thing here, which is what I need to highlight, is that these gains remain constrained and remain mostly superficial. Iran's missile launches and continued nuclear advances, despite some of the physical damage that we cannot, it will undoubtedly surface up over the coming days, mean the perceived threat has not been neutralized. That is, on the contrary. In fact, Iran will likely reinforce its strategic intent and reframe the confrontation that it has gone, and the violations that it will perceive that it has undergone, to galvanize domestic support, but also international support for its nuclear development. So, in fact, we are closer to Iran actually weaponizing its nuclear program, even though secretively. than at any stage that we've had before. And by escalating and drawing the US, Iran has risked, in fact, further erosion of its deterrent symmetry, and has appeared, particularly to the countries that aim to normalize its relations with, as an extremely irrational actor in the region. So the military objectives were partially met, but the underlying threat calculus and the strategic dynamics that involve this conflict now face more emboldenedness, and actually we may see emboldened activity by support networks by Iran, and the reputational scrutiny also on another end that Israel will face going forward is likely to be tenfold than it was before the conflict.
I want to stick with the United States of America and Donald Trump, and them now directly being involved in this war between Iran and Israel. We saw U.S. bombing Iranian nuclear facilities just a few days ago. How significant was this step in the greater scheme of things? And what message does this send about American foreign policy and Trump 2.0, essentially?
So we those attacks taken out of context or out of the wider picture would be seen as a return to the U.S. direct foots on the ground involvement in the Middle East region kind of situation, or the precursor to that. However, as we all know, that as President Donald Trump's mandate is largely to disengage U.S. involvement in the Middle East, one, and to move focus eastwards towards China, but also a peace-only president that has always been part of the rhetoric. Now, these strikes come in opposition to a lot of that rhetoric, right? However, they must be seen at this stage, at least, as a once-off, a show of seriousness towards Iran to push it to facilitate stronger negotiations. Of course, as we discussed, some of these objectives were not met. Now, because Iran's response last night was largely calibrated, and rather than a full-scale escalation, this provided the region and the conflict with a strong off ramp. So while targeting a critical U.S. military installation in Doha, in Qatar Al Udeid, Iran did limit its action to avoid mass casualties, and also through reports that we've heard, trying to strike unoccupied areas of the base. So giving advance warnings through its intermediaries, and particularly towards Qatar. So this it allowed Iran to demonstrate its capacity, but preserve credibility at home, while avoiding a direct confrontation that could trigger wider conflict. If this attack was more widespread and involved no warnings and actually caused casualties on the ground, the strikes could have drawn the region very quickly into a quick conflagration with direct U.S. more involvement from the United States. But the strikes served as a release valve, so it satisfied the domestic and regional allies, uh, at the same without crossing escalation thresholds that could have invited this overwhelming retaliation by those forces. And in fact, it could have also unified a Gulf position against Iran. So this was a massive gamble, but it again speaks to reasonable and sensible partners in the region, such as Qatar. If this had happened in another country, for instance, the reaction might have been much worse. But it actually, because it happened in Qatar, it really enabled the Qatar's diplomacy and soft posture within the region to reactivate quickly a ceasefire deal between the United States and Iran, and Israel on the other hand.
I want to focus on that theme. Middle Eastern countries, Gulf countries, how they've reacted to this war in the last few weeks. They've been under scrutiny, especially looking at the genocide in Gaza. Just your assessment on how they went about condemning or not condemning the United States of America, and which side of the fence they looked to be standing on.
So, in this particular conflict between Israel and Iran and the United States support from the back, they were unequivocally all the countries, all the Gulf countries in the region, anti this war, and have taken strong positions, in terms of public positions, and but also backdoor channels to try and end the conflict, because mainly because of how much damage this will have on their national securities, but also on their long-term strategic interests, particularly if oil and energy prices and logistics around that were hindered, and it comes at a quite a difficult time, a technical time in terms of global economy, anyways. So their positions around this conflict was quite consistent. Of course, a few countries played a more advanced role in de-escalation, particularly Qatar, which also its facilitation of communication and managing the escalation, also using the targeting on its sovereignty to pivot the conflict into de-escalation very quickly. So Qatar has this broader utility to lay its access to diplomacy, and is trusted enough by both Iran to carry sensitive messages, but also maintains its operational proximity to the US to handle this messaging quite well. On the Palestinian issue, of course, the case is quite different, and it's mainly because of the lack of enforceability around any of the decisions that the Gulf countries play, or the wider Middle East. Of course, there's been several Arab League summits since the start of the war, emergency summits and routine ones that have not really advanced the Palestinian cause in any positive manner. In fact, what we're likely to see through the ceasefire between Israel and Iran is a more concerted effort by the Israelis to escalate the hostilities in both Gaza and possibly also the West Bank.
Mm,
Iran may be weakened for a while, particularly and unable to activate responses towards Israel's settlement project, at least. And we are very likely to see a stronger push by this Netanyahu administration in Israel to consolidate its positioning within the West Bank and push for further settlements, including also finalizing an end game for Gaza. We still don't know what that means, although a forceful displacement is not off the cards. It may return back to the stage, given the level of disregard and carte blanche that the current Israeli government is operating under.
mm, I would like to bring it a bit closer to home, South Africa, to be exact, and maybe just the global South in general. Our country, South Africa, has consistently positioned itself as a major critic of Israeli aggression. What kind of pressure does this choose place on Pretoria, especially given our ties with Iran? They are our BRICS Plus partners, and we have been quite unequivocal when it comes to the condemnation of Israel. The ICJ proceedings being one of the major events that we did so. But South Africa and the global South in general, how should we be taking the news and reacting to them?
So South Africa has been very consistent in its positioning, and it's played a positive role in global diplomacy, a positive role in mediation, and a positive role in terms of upholding humanitarian rights, and particularly for the people of Palestine. Now, this has really advanced South Africa's soft power, particularly within the global South, and has elevated its status. And really, many countries would have seen it punching above its weight. Of course, it came with repercussions, as we all know. particularly in denting its U.S. relations, its relations with the United States. But at the same time, South Africa's advanced diplomatic tools managed to contain the spread of that of deteriorating relations with the United States. So I don't think we're likely to see any major shifts or any major changes from South Africa. In fact, we're likely to see more and more countries internationally adopt similar stances to South Africa. We're already seeing European countries, for instance, such as Spain and Norway, and growingly others from the global south, taking more bolder stances, really being led by a strong moral position that South Africa put down on the ground. Many other countries are following suit. So the precedent for diplomacy is really being set by South Africa, and we're likely to see South Africa be a part of a global movement that adds more and more pressure on Israel.
Mm, mm, mm. Finally, Bilal, as someone that's deeply engaged, on this war and just the general Middle Eastern, events, what should we be watching for in the next coming days, and what might all of it mean for the future of maybe nuclear non-proliferation and global conflict norms and standards?
So, quick, just to focus on the conflict itself, and we may have not explained this as best as I should initially.
Mm,
This does not mean the end of the conflict. The immediate outlook for the region is one of constrained de-escalation, which will be underpinned by residual volatility. So the ceasefire between Iran and Israel reduces direct military engagement at this stage in the near term, but it will definitely remain fragile and mainly contingent on restraint by both parties and the absence of unauthorized, for instance, proxy activity by actors right in the region. But yes, we have seen a shift of U.S. Posturing around the conflict from escalation to containment, which is an
mm,
important and a necessary step for de-escalation. Um, However, we any misstep or any miscalculation, we may see a return of return to conflict. Particularly, we have quite volatile actors in this engaged in the general dynamics of what we saw over the past few days. Now, what this means for non-nuclear proliferation, this actually sends quite an adverse message to mid powers around the world, including Saudi Arabia and others, that the only way to national stability and sovereignty is through nuclear power. A country like North Korea, for instance, despite its rhetoric and despite its positioning and its anti-Western rhetoric, etc., has no one has thought of invading or carrying out airstrikes on, mainly because it has a nuclear weapon. So this message would have rang hard around many countries in the world that if we have the capabilities to activate a weaponized nuclear program, we should. Of course, this is a very dangerous precedent that is set.
mm, mm,
For instance, and of course, the IEA, the International Authority on Energy, will likely find it more difficult to monitor because many countries will adopt secretive nuclear programs going forward. So we are likely to be entering a stage of increased international volatility and complexity around non-nuclear proliferation over the coming years.
mm. Very, very concerning state of affairs there, Bilal. But thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure chatting to you, and I'm sure with developments coming in thick and fast from the Middle East, we'll definitely be catching up soon.
Will always be a pleasure. Thank you, Silelo. Have a good day.
There you go. And that brings us to the end of a truly critical conversation with Bilal Bassiouni, CEO and founder of the Center for Africa and Near East Studies. And yeah, as the dust seemingly settles, both literally and diplomatically, on what's being called the 12th Day War, I think we can all agree that at this point we are left with more questions than answers. Granted, ceasefire may be in place, but I don't think trust is. Lives have been lost, nuclear scientists assassinated, and the threat of escalation still simmers quite strong just beneath the surface. And what's interesting for me is what we've seen is not just a regional conflict. I think it is a moment that could redefine global alliances. It could define the world as we know it. I think you heard there from Bilal that we could be moving to a point where more and more countries start considering secretive nuclear programs because, well, it seems to be a deterrent. Seems to be a deterrent, from countries invading your country, having boots on the ground. It's a deterrent for countries to, put you under pressure, when it comes to the geopolitics of the new world. And it exposed the fragility of international law, to be honest. And I think it'll be interesting to see how this new world order will be redefined. Scary times, eh? To think that the direction that the world is going to now is, hey, look at North Korea. No one is attacking them, and they have openly said we do have nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction. We've seen the restraint that the United States of America and Israel has went about dealing with Iran. So maybe that's the answer. Eh? The answer could ultimately be countries all across the world saying, "Hey, if we have the capabilities of nuclear, then let's do it." And that's a concerning state of affairs. That's something we all should be worried about. Going to take a quick break. If you missed any part of this discussion, catch it on replay on our various social media pages or on salammedia.com. It'll be podcasted later today. And you can join the conversation on hashtag news and views on our various social media pages. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back after this.